The village of St. Haverley lay beneath a pale spring sky, the sort of gentle afternoon that encouraged slow walks, polite conversation, and the quiet comfort of routine. The hedgerows were trimmed neatly, the gardens freshly coaxed into bloom, and the narrow lane that curved past the village green hummed with the soft chatter of neighbours who had known one another for decades. It was the annual garden gathering at Haverley Manor, an event the villagers anticipated each year with a mixture of excitement and mild curiosity. The manor itself stood slightly apart from the village centre, a dignified stone house whose age lent it a certain gravity. Its lawn, carefully kept and wide as a small field, now held rows of white tables dressed with lace cloths and delicate china teacups. Clusters of villagers drifted between the tables like migrating birds, exchanging greetings and quiet observations about the weather, the roses, and one another. Miss Jane Marple sat near the edge of the gathering beneath a striped parasol, her knitting resting lightly in her lap. She appeared exactly as she always did, a small, elderly lady with gentle eyes and a patient expression that suggested little more than polite interest in the world around her. Yet Miss Marple's gaze moved with subtle precision from face to face. She noticed things. The way Mrs. Calder spoke with exaggerated enthusiasm when discussing the roses, while her eyes repeatedly wandered toward the manor's terrace. The stiff posture of Colonel Arthur Whitcomb, recently retired and clearly uncomfortable among so many villagers, and the curious tension between two younger guests standing near the lemonade table, Miss Eleanor Fielding and a tall, dark-haired gentleman whom several people whispered was connected to the Foreign Office. None of it seemed remarkable to anyone else. To Miss Marple, however, people were rather like patterns in knitting. When a stitch was out of place, the entire design eventually revealed it. "Such a lovely afternoon," said Mrs. Bantry, settling into the chair beside her with a satisfied sigh. "One almost forgets how dreadful things have been in the newspapers lately." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, the world does seem quite unsettled," she said. Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice in a conspiratorial tone. "They say Sir Lionel has been entertaining very important visitors from London, diplomatic people. Something to do with international matters." Miss Marple glanced across the lawn toward the terrace. Sir Lionel Haverley stood there greeting guests with smooth confidence. He was a tall man with silver at his temples and the practiced smile of someone accustomed to influence. Years earlier he had served in government circles, though exactly what his work had involved was something the village never fully understood. At his side stood a man Miss Marple did not recognize. The stranger was lean, sharp-eyed, and watched the crowd with a guarded expression that suggested he was measuring each person he saw. "Colonel Whitcomb seems to know him," Mrs. Bantry added quietly. Miss Marple observed the two men exchange a brief nod that held none of the warmth expected between acquaintances. Interesting. Across the lawn, laughter rose from a table where several younger guests were gathered. Among them was Eleanor Fielding, whose bright intelligence and quick wit had made her something of a curiosity in the village. She worked, people said, in London, something involving archives and government records. At that moment she appeared distracted. Her gaze moved repeatedly toward the manor house itself. Miss Marple noticed something else as well. A young footman emerged briefly through the terrace doors, carrying a silver tray. As he passed behind Sir Lionel, the older man slipped a folded envelope from his pocket and placed it quietly beneath the tray. The motion was swift, careful, almost secretive. The footman hesitated, just long enough to acknowledge the instruction without words, then disappeared back into the house. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "Curious," she murmured softly. Mrs. Bantry looked over. "Did you say something, dear?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," Miss Marple replied with a small smile, but her eyes lingered on Sir Lionel. Not 5 minutes later the sound came. It was sharp, violent, and entirely out of place in the gentle calm of the garden party. For a moment, no one understood what they had heard. Then a woman's scream. The terrace doors burst open as the young footman staggered out onto the lawn, his face pale with terror. "He's been shot," the boy gasped. The crowd froze. "Sir Lionel?" Chairs scraped against stone. Teacups shattered against the terrace floor as guests rushed forward in confusion. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Inside the manor's drawing room, Sir Lionel Haverley lay collapsed beside a writing desk. One arm hung loosely at his side, his expression frozen in startled disbelief. A dark stain spread across his waistcoat. Colonel Whitcomb knelt beside the body, his military composure strained but intact as he checked for a pulse. After a moment, he looked up grimly. "He's dead." The words rippled through the room like a cold wind. Guests whispered in alarm, their voices rising in overlapping speculation. A gunshot. Who would do such a thing here? It must have been an accident. But Miss Marple remained near the doorway, quietly observing the people gathered around the room. Eleanor Fielding stood near the window, her face drained of color. The dark-haired stranger from London watched everything with unsettling stillness. And the footman who had carried the silver tray trembled violently, clutching the empty platter as though it were the only solid object left in the world. Miss Marple's eyes drifted slowly toward the writing desk. The folded envelope that Sir Lionel had hidden moments earlier now lay open beside the body. Several sheets of paper had spilled partly onto the floor. At first glance they looked ordinary enough, but Miss Marple noticed the markings printed across the top page, strange symbols, maps, military coordinates, and a phrase typed neatly across the header that made her thin brows lift slightly. Sekliabt strg argemen, Rupen defense Kuskal. Miss Marple folded her hands together gently. How very unfortunate, she thought. A murder was always dreadful, but a murder tied to secrets powerful enough to start a war, that was something far more dangerous than anything the quiet village of St. Haverley had ever imagined. By the time the police arrived from Much Benham, the bright afternoon had altered so completely in spirit that it seemed impossible to believe the sun still shone upon the lawn outside. The white tables remained where they had been set, the teapots stood cooling beside untouched cakes, and the crocuses near the stone path moved gently in the breeze as if nothing at all had happened. Yet inside Haverley Manor the air had become thick with alarm, whispers and the peculiar strained politeness that so often follows sudden violence among the well-bred. Inspector Mallory was a broad, deliberate man with a reddish face and the expression of one who disliked disorder, particularly when it arrived dressed in afternoon clothes. He listened first to Colonel Whitcomb, then to the footman, then to Sir Lionel's butler, asking the same questions in slightly different forms, as if truth might be cornered by repetition. A constable stood at the drawing-room door to keep the guests back, though there was little danger of anyone pressing forward. Most of them preferred to remain in the morning-room where shock could disguise itself as concern and concern as a justified appetite for rumor. Miss Marple sat quietly in a high-backed chair near the window, her knitting once more in her hands, though she made very little progress. She did not appear to be listening. In consequence, people spoke before her with remarkable freedom. "It must be some political business," whispered Mrs. Calder, who had attached herself firmly to Mrs. Bantry. "Those papers on the floor looked official. I saw stamps or seals or something equally foreign." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Bantry, though not with conviction. "Murder is nearly always personal in the end. Politics only make people feel grander about wickedness." That observation, Miss Marple reflected, was very sensible. Across the room, Eleanor Fielding stood near the mantel with one gloved hand pressed to her wrist. She had regained her composure, though only just. There was nothing theatrical about her distress. If anything, she seemed determined to conceal it. Her eyes, however, kept turning toward the hall whenever Inspector Mallory's voice sounded. Not with fear alone, Miss Marple thought, but with expectation. The dark-haired gentleman, introduced earlier as Mr. Julian Ashcombe, displayed no visible agitation at all. He was speaking in a low tone to Colonel Whitcomb, his manner precise and restrained. He had the look of a man accustomed to withholding more than he said. Miss Marple had encountered that sort before, though usually in parish committees rather than affairs of state. People believed secrecy belonged only to governments and criminals, but village life taught one otherwise. Inspector Mallory entered at last, removing his hat and looking round at the assembled guests with professional impatience. "I must ask that no one leave the house until statements have been taken," he said. Sir Lionel was shot at close range, likely within minutes of entering the drawing-room. The weapon has not been found. There was a collective intake of breath. "At close range," repeated Mrs. Calder faintly. "Then someone in the house, very possibly," said the inspector, "and as the room opens onto the terrace and the side passage, we cannot yet exclude anyone." Julian Ashcombe stepped forward. The papers found near Sir Lionel must be secured immediately. Mallory turned his head. "They are secured, sir. You may not understand their importance." The inspector's face hardened a little. "I understand murder, Mr. Ashcombe. That is sufficient for the present." The remark produced a small silence. Colonel Whitcomb shifted uneasily, as though he would have liked to smooth matters over but knew better than to try. Eleanor Fielding looked down at the carpet. Miss Marple's needles clicked once. Very often she had found the thing people were most anxious to protect was not always the thing most at risk. Mr. Ashcombe's concern for the documents might be entirely natural, yet there was in his tone not merely urgency but possession. A maid entered with a tray of fresh tea that nobody wanted. Her hands shook so badly that the cups rattled in their saucers. As she moved around the room, Miss Marple noticed the young footman Edwin. Someone had called him, standing near the door with a face still white from shock. He looked not only frightened but burdened, like a child keeping hold of a dreadful secret because he had not yet discovered whom it might harm. Miss Marple waited until the maid had passed, and then beckoned him with the faintest movement of her fingers. "You carried something into the drawing-room just before the terrible event, did you not?" she asked in the mild tone of an elderly lady interested in household routine. The boy swallowed. "Yes, miss. A note." He looked startled. I only did as Sir Lionel told me." "Of course. And did he say to whom it was to be delivered?" "No, miss. Only that it was to be left on the desk. But when I came in," he faltered, his eyes filling suddenly. "He was already down. I dropped the tray. I thought at first he'd fainted." Miss Marple gave a little murmur of sympathy. "And the note?" "I don't know, miss. I never looked." That, she thought, was probably true. Boys in service noticed more than they were given credit for, but not always in the direction one expected. Before she could say more, Inspector Mallory called the footman away. Statements were to be taken one by one in Sir Lionel's study. The guests settled into uneasy waiting. Outside, a motor car passed on the village road, absurdly ordinary. Mrs. Bantry leaned nearer. "Jane, my dear, you have that look." "What look?" said Miss Marple. "The one that means someone is behaving in a way you dislike." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not dislike, perhaps. Only inconsistency. It is so often the smallest inconsistencies that matter." She was thinking of Eleanor Fielding. A young woman in genuine shock might tremble, cry, or grow silent. Eleanor had done none of those things exactly. She was alert beneath her distress, watching not the body nor even the police, but the reactions of the others. One might say she feared accusation, or one might say she feared something else entirely. At that moment Eleanor crossed the room toward the window alcove where Miss Marple sat. "Miss Marple," she said, lowering her voice, "I believe we met once at a luncheon in London, though you may not remember me. My memory for faces is usually better than my memory for speeches," said Miss Marple kindly. A flicker of relief passed over the girl's face, followed almost immediately by determination. "I wondered whether I might speak to you privately later." Miss Marple looked up into her strained, intelligent eyes. "Certainly." Eleanor hesitated. "There are things about Sir Lionel that the inspector may not understand properly, and if they are misunderstood—" She broke off and glanced toward the doorway, where Julian Ashcombe had just appeared. "It could become very serious." Miss Marple followed her gaze. Mr. Ashcombe was not looking at Eleanor, but at the clock on the mantel, as though measuring time against some private calculation. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "I think it very likely that it could." Eleanor moved away at once, having perhaps said more than she intended. A few moments later the butler entered carrying a silver salver, on which lay several personal effects recovered from the drawing-room: Sir Lionel's watch, spectacles, keys, and a slim leather cigarette case. He brought them to Inspector Mallory, who happened at that moment to be passing through the room. The inspector glanced down, took the watch, and handed the tray back with little interest. But Miss Marple's eyes had gone at once to the cigarette case. It was closed, but not properly. A corner of thin blue paper was caught in the hinge, barely visible unless one happened to be sitting at exactly the right angle and had spent a lifetime observing minor domestic irregularities. Blue paper was uncommon in men's correspondence. Far more often it was used for private notes or for copied memoranda intended not to attract attention. Miss Marple's knitting rested motionless in her lap. Somewhere in this house, among frightened villagers and guarded officials, something had already gone missing before the police even knew it was there. The atmosphere inside Haverley Manor had grown steadily heavier as the afternoon drifted toward evening. The bright warmth that had filled the gardens earlier seemed now like a memory belonging to another day entirely. The sky outside the tall windows was beginning to soften into that pale gold light that arrives before sunset, but within the manor every voice had become cautious and subdued. Inspector Mallory had established himself firmly in Sir Lionel's study. One by one the guests were called in to give their statements. Each returned to the morning room afterward with the same strained composure, their faces revealing little, though their eyes often betrayed the effort of recalling events with absolute precision. Miss Marple continued to sit quietly by the window. Her knitting had progressed only slightly, but the small clicking of the needles provided a comforting rhythm in a room otherwise filled with restless silence. Mrs. Bantry, who had already given her statement, leaned close again. "Such a dreadful business," she murmured. "The inspector asked the most peculiar questions. Whether I noticed anyone leaving the terrace, whether Sir Lionel seemed anxious, whether anyone appeared to be watching him." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And what did you say?" "The truth, of course, that everyone appeared perfectly ordinary." Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was often the most dangerous quality a person could possess. Across the room, Colonel Whitcomb had positioned himself near the fireplace, standing stiffly with his back straight and his hands clasped behind him in unmistakably military fashion. His expression suggested both irritation and restraint, as though he were accustomed to command rather than questioning. Not far from him stood Julian Ashcombe. He had been interviewed earlier, yet instead of settling with the other guests, he remained quietly alert, moving occasionally toward the hall or the terrace doors. It was not nervousness exactly. Rather, Miss Marple thought, it resembled the watchfulness of a man waiting for a signal. Eleanor Fielding sat alone near the writing desk in the corner of the room. She held a teacup she had forgotten to drink from, staring into the untouched liquid as though hoping it might offer some solution. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her for a moment. Young people who lived close to secrets often developed that particular stillness. The door opened and the butler entered. "Miss Fielding," he said quietly. "The inspector will see you now." Eleanor stood at once, setting down the cup with careful control. She crossed the room quickly, but just before leaving, she glanced briefly toward Miss Marple. It was a curious glance. Not quite fear, not quite appeal. Something more like recognition. Miss Marple inclined her head gently in response, though she was not certain the girl noticed. The door closed behind her. Mrs. Calder, who had been whispering near the mantel, leaned closer to the others. "They say Sir Lionel was involved in matters of national security," she said in a hushed voice. "Those papers the police collected were official agreements between governments." Mrs. Bantry sniffed slightly. If governments truly wished to keep secrets, they would avoid writing them on paper altogether. That observation, Miss Marple privately agreed, had a great deal of merit. Nearly 20 minutes passed before Eleanor returned. Her expression had changed. The visible distress remained, but beneath it something else had appeared, a certain guarded firmness, as though she had chosen carefully what to say and what to leave unsaid. Inspector Mallory followed her a moment later. He looked tired. "Thank you for your patience," he announced to the room. "For the moment, no one is permitted to leave the village until further notice. Sir Lionel's death raises several serious questions." No one spoke. "The weapon has still not been located," the inspector continued, "which suggests that whoever fired the shot may have had time to conceal it." A faint murmur passed through the guests. Colonel Whitcomb cleared his throat. "Inspector, are you suggesting the murderer is among us?" Mallory looked directly at him. "At present, Colonel, everyone present during the garden gathering must be considered a potential witness." The distinction was deliberate. Miss Marple noticed that Julian Ashcombe's eyes narrowed slightly. Eleanor lowered her gaze. The inspector continued speaking with steady authority. "According to the timeline, Sir Lionel left the garden party shortly after 4:30. Several guests saw him enter the house alone. Within 5 minutes, the shot was heard. And no one saw anyone else go inside?" Mrs. Calder asked nervously. "Not clearly," said Mallory. but there are several entrances. Anyone familiar with the house could have used the side passage. That remark caused Colonel Whitcomb to shift again. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. Men who spent years commanding troops often disliked uncertainty more than danger itself. Just then a sudden commotion arose in the hallway. The young footman Edwin appeared in the doorway again, visibly shaken. "Inspector, sir, I think you should see this." Mallory frowned. "What is it? There's something missing." The room grew still. "Missing?" the inspector repeated. "Yes, sir." From Sir Lionel's study. Mallory followed the boy immediately, several guests rising instinctively to watch from the doorway. Miss Marple did not hurry. She rose slowly and made her way into the hall with quiet dignity, arriving just as the inspector stepped into the study again. Sir Lionel's desk had been cleared except for a few remaining papers and writing instruments. Edwin pointed toward an open drawer. "It was here earlier, sir. I remember seeing it when the police first looked through the desk." "What was?" Mallory asked sharply. "A small metal box, locked." The inspector's expression darkened. "Are you certain?" "Yes, sir. Sir Lionel kept it in that drawer. I've seen him take it out before." Colonel Whitcomb stepped forward from the doorway. "What sort of box?" The boy hesitated. "Just a little steel case. Important looking." Mallory turned slowly toward the room. "And now it's gone." No one spoke. The realization settled across the gathering like a shadow. If Sir Lionel had been killed for the documents lying beside him, those papers were still present. But something else, something hidden in that locked case, had disappeared entirely. Miss Marple stood near the study entrance, her hands folded calmly over her knitting. Her eyes drifted slowly across the faces gathered in the hall. Fear, curiosity, suspicion, and in one face a brief, almost imperceptible flicker of relief. She did not look twice. One never needed to. After a moment she spoke gently, almost as if addressing no one in particular. "How very strange." Inspector Mallory turned toward her. "Strange, Miss Marple?" "Yes." Her voice remained mild. "One so often hears that secrets cause terrible trouble in the world." She paused thoughtfully. "But in my experience, it is rarely the secret itself that causes the most damage." The inspector frowned slightly. "What does?" Miss Marple looked toward the open desk drawer. "The person who is most afraid of it being discovered." The discovery of the missing metal box altered the mood within Haverley Manor in a subtle but unmistakable way. Until that moment the murder had been dreadful, but still comprehensible, one violent act, shocking yet contained within the walls of the house. But the idea that something important had already vanished from Sir Lionel's study suggested that the crime was not merely personal or impulsive. It implied planning, purpose, and perhaps consequences that reached well beyond the quiet lanes of St. Haverley. Inspector Mallory stood beside the desk, examining the open drawer as though the empty space itself might provide answers. "You're certain it was here earlier?" he asked Edwin again. "Yes, sir, I'm quite sure of it." "Who else saw it?" The boy hesitated, glancing nervously toward the guests gathered in the doorway. "I don't know, sir. I only noticed it when the officers first looked through the desk." Mallory straightened slowly. His eyes moved across the room. "That means the box disappeared after the police began their examination. The implications settled over everyone present. Someone in the house had taken it, and they had done so while the investigation was already underway." Colonel Whitcomb spoke first. "Inspector, surely the officers themselves would have noticed such a thing." "They would," Mallory replied shortly. "Which means the box was removed later." His gaze paused briefly on each face in turn. Mrs. Calder shrank back as though personally accused. Mrs. Bantry lifted her chin with mild indignation. The butler remained composed, though his lips had tightened. Julian Ashcombe's expression, however, did not change at all. Miss Marple observed that with interest. Eleanor Fielding had stepped back slightly into the hall. Her hands were clasped tightly together, though her face remained calm. If she was afraid, she was determined not to show it. Inspector Mallory turned to the constable. "No one leaves the house. Search the study and the adjoining rooms again." "Yes, sir." The constable began carefully checking the shelves and cabinets while another officer examined the carpet near the desk. Miss Marple remained near the doorway, watching quietly. It was curious, she reflected, how often people believed objects disappeared because someone was clever enough to hide them. In truth, the opposite was usually the case. Most things vanished simply because no one thought to look in the obvious place. Her gaze drifted slowly around the study. The desk, the armchair near the window, the tall cabinet of books along the far wall, and finally the small waste-paper basket beside the writing table. It had already been examined earlier, yet something about its position seemed slightly altered. Miss Marple stepped forward gently. "Inspector," she said in her soft voice, "might I ask a small question?" Mallory looked up with mild surprise. "Yes, Miss Marple." "That basket," she said, indicating the one beside the desk. "Was it there earlier this afternoon?" The inspector glanced at it briefly. "Where else would it be?" "Oh, quite so," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "It only struck me that it seems rather full for such a short period of time." Mallory frowned and bent to inspect it. Inside were several torn envelopes, a few scraps of paper, and what appeared to be a crumpled sheet of carbon copy paper. The inspector lifted it carefully. The room grew very still. He smoothed the page against the desk. Tacked across the top was a faint duplicate of a document header. Sekliat Strgi Riemann, Rupen Defense Council. Below that, however, were several lines of typed text that had not appeared on the papers found beside Sir Lionel's body. Inspector Mallory read silently. His expression hardened. "What is it?" Colonel Whitcomb demanded. Mallory did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward Julian Ashcombe. "Mr. Ashcombe, perhaps you'd care to explain why a draft memorandum concerning military positioning in Eastern Europe would be sitting in Sir Lionel's wastebasket?" The room seemed to shrink. Ashcombe did not look surprised. He studied the document for a moment, then spoke calmly. "It appears to be a discarded carbon copy of a working draft. And what does it mean?" Whitcomb asked sharply. Ashcombe's gaze shifted briefly toward the others in the room. "It means," he said quietly, "that Sir Lionel was involved in negotiations concerning an international defense agreement." Mrs. Calder gave a small gasp. "You mean politics? Something rather larger than politics?" Ashcombe replied. Inspector Mallory's patience was clearly wearing thin. "If this has anything to do with the murder, I suggest you explain it plainly." Ashcombe hesitated. For the first time since the shooting, a faint tension appeared in his face. The agreement Sir Lionel was helping to coordinate involved several European governments, he said carefully. Its purpose was to stabilize a growing military conflict along certain borders. "And the missing box?" the inspector asked. Ashcombe met his gaze. It likely contained the final authorization codes and diplomatic confirmations. There was silence. Even Colonel Whitcomb looked unsettled now. "If that box contained those materials," the colonel said slowly, "and it has been stolen." Ashcombe finished the thought quietly. "Then someone now possesses documents capable of sabotaging the entire agreement." Mrs. Bantry spoke faintly. "You mean starting a war?" Ashcombe did not answer. He did not need to. Miss Marple had been watching Eleanor Fielding during the exchange. The young woman had grown very pale, but something in her expression was not quite fear. It was closer to recognition. Inspector Mallory folded the carbon sheet slowly. "So let me be certain I understand," he said. "Sir Lionel was negotiating a highly sensitive international agreement. He is murdered, and the only item missing from his desk is a locked box containing the final confirmation of that agreement." "Yes," said Ashcombe quietly. Mallory looked around the room. "And someone in this house now has it." A long silence followed. Outside, the evening wind stirred the branches of the old lime trees along the drive. Miss Marple's knitting needles rested quietly in her hands. Her thoughts moved not toward governments or treaties, but toward something far simpler: human nature. Secrets rarely caused violence by themselves, but fear did. Fear of exposure, fear of exposure, fear of betrayal, fear of losing something that had already been taken too far. Her eyes drifted slowly toward Eleanor Fielding, and then toward Julian Ashcombe. One of them, she thought calmly, was afraid for the world. The other was afraid for themselves. The house had grown unnaturally quiet as evening settled over Haverley Manor. Lamps had been lit in the hall and drawing room, their soft yellow light creating pockets of shadow against the tall panelled walls. Outside, the last of the daylight had faded into a deep blue dusk, and the garden party tables remained abandoned on the lawn like remnants of a celebration that had ended badly. Inspector Mallory had ordered a search of the entire house. 2 constables moved carefully through the corridors, checking cupboards, cabinets, and unused rooms. The servants had been questioned once more, though none of them had left the kitchen wing since the shooting. Yet the small metal box had not appeared. That fact alone had begun to trouble the inspector more than the murder itself. In the drawing room, the remaining guests waited with strained patience. Conversation had dwindled to occasional whispers. The earlier curiosity had been replaced by a quieter, heavier emotion unease. Miss Marple sat again near the window, though the garden outside was now only a dim outline beneath the rising moon. Mrs. Bantry leaned close, speaking softly. "My dear Jane, I cannot imagine how such a dreadful object can simply disappear from a house filled with police." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked gently. "It is rarely the object that disappears," she said mildly. "More often it is the opportunity that goes unnoticed." Mrs. Bantry frowned slightly. "I'm not sure I understand." Miss Marple did not elaborate. Instead, she allowed her eyes to wander once more around the room. Colonel Whitcomb moved to the writing desk and stood examining a framed photograph there, perhaps simply to give himself something to do. His military posture remained rigid, but there was strain in his face now. A man accustomed to order disliked mysteries that refused to arrange themselves properly. Julian Ashcombe stood near the fireplace, speaking quietly with Inspector Mallory. His voice remained calm, though his tone carried a persistent urgency. The longer those documents remain missing, the greater the potential damage, he was saying. Mallory folded his arms. "Mr. Ashcombe, I'm far more concerned about the fact that a man has been murdered." Ashcombe's reply was cool. "With respect, Inspector, the 2 matters are almost certainly connected." Miss Marple noted the way he spoke, not as someone offering speculation, but as someone already convinced. Across the room, Eleanor Fielding remained seated in a small armchair, her hands resting tightly in her lap. She had not spoken for some time. Miss Marple observed her carefully. Young Miss Fielding was clearly intelligent. That much had been obvious from the moment she arrived earlier that afternoon. Yet intelligence alone did not explain the particular tension visible now in the girl's expression. She was not merely frightened, she was calculating. At that moment, Eleanor rose and moved slowly toward the hall as though seeking a moment of air. Her movement attracted little attention, except Miss Marple's. After a moment, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and followed at a leisurely pace. The corridor beyond the drawing-room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the wall lamps reflecting faintly off the polished floorboards. Eleanor stood near the tall window at the end of the hall, looking out into the darkness. She turned slightly when she heard Miss Marple's gentle footsteps. "I hoped you might come," Eleanor said quietly. Miss Marple smiled kindly. "My dear, I find people rarely say such things unless they truly need someone to listen." For a moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she spoke in a low, controlled voice. "You've already noticed, haven't you?" "Noticed what?" "That something about today doesn't make sense." Miss Marple considered this. "A great many things today do not make sense," she said pleasantly. "We must be careful which one to start with." Eleanor gave a small, tired laugh. "That sounds exactly like something my grandmother would say." Miss Marple leaned lightly on her cane. Grandmothers can be very observant creatures. The girl hesitated. When Sir Lionel was killed, everyone assumed the papers beside him were the important ones. "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "But they weren't." Miss Marple watched her without interrupting. "The real information," Eleanor continued, "was never in those documents. They were only summaries. The actual agreement details were stored in the authorization codes inside that metal box." "And you knew this?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor nodded. "I worked with Sir Lionel in London. I helped prepare the archives for the negotiations." Her voice dropped even lower. "If the codes in that box were altered or delivered to the wrong government, it could make it appear as though one country had broken the agreement." Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful. "And that might lead to rather unpleasant misunderstandings." "Yes," Eleanor whispered. the sort that armies respond to. The hallway seemed colder suddenly. Miss Marple studied the young woman's face. "You believe someone intended exactly that?" Eleanor met her gaze. "Yes? And you suspect who?" The girl hesitated again. Then she glanced briefly toward the drawing room where voices could still be heard. "I think," she said slowly, "Sir Lionel discovered someone was planning to steal the authorization codes." "And confronted them?" "Yes." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "That would explain the shooting." But something still troubled her. "There is one small difficulty," she added gently. Eleanor frowned. "What difficulty?" "If the killer wanted the box," Miss Marple said, "they would have taken it immediately." "But they did they?" Eleanor looked puzzled. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "The police searched the desk shortly after the murder. The box was still there at that time." The realization dawned slowly in Eleanor's eyes. "You mean the box was taken later?" Miss Marple finished. A soft sound came from behind them. Footsteps. Both women turned. Julian Ashcombe stood at the end of the corridor, half concealed in the shadow near the drawing-room doorway. His expression was unreadable. "I wondered where Miss Fielding had gone," he said quietly. Eleanor's face tightened. Ashcombe's gaze moved slowly between them. "I hope," he added calmly, "that you are not discussing matters that might complicate the investigation." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, no," she said. "We were merely discussing human nature." Ashcombe's eyes rested on her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he said softly, "Human nature can be a very dangerous subject, Miss Marple." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "Yes," she agreed, "particularly for those who misunderstand it." The quiet tension in the corridor lingered for several seconds after Julian Ashcombe spoke. The soft light from the wall lamps cast long shadows across the polished floor, and for a moment no one moved. Eleanor Fielding's posture had stiffened slightly. She stood very straight now, her hands clasped together as though steadying herself. Miss Marple, however, remained perfectly composed. Ashcombe stepped forward from the shadows with unhurried confidence. His eyes moved from Eleanor to Miss Marple and back again, measuring them both with the careful calm of a man accustomed to watching reactions rather than words. "I'm afraid Inspector Mallory will want to speak with Miss Fielding again," he said. Eleanor frowned slightly. "Again, there are still questions regarding the documents." Miss Marple noticed something curious. Ashcombe had not said the inspector asked for her. He had said the inspector would want to. A subtle difference. Eleanor seemed to notice it as well. "I've already given my statement," she said evenly. Ashcombe offered a polite, almost reassuring smile. "I'm sure you have, but circumstances have changed since then." Miss Marple watched him closely. There was no visible threat in his voice. No anger, only quiet control. And that, she reflected, was often far more persuasive. Footsteps sounded again from the drawing-room, and Inspector Mallory appeared in the doorway, removing his spectacles as he glanced down the hall. "Ah, there you are, Miss Fielding," he said. "I was just about to ask for you." Ashcombe did not react. Eleanor walked toward the inspector without protest, though the tension in her shoulders remained visible. "I'm sorry to trouble you again," Mallory said, gesturing toward the study, "but there's something I'd like clarified." They disappeared down the corridor, leaving Miss Marple alone with Julian Ashcombe. For a moment he remained silent. Then he spoke with quiet curiosity. "You seem remarkably calm considering the circumstances." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "At my age, one learns that panic rarely improves the situation." Ashcombe studied her carefully. "I understand you have a reputation for noticing things." "My dear sir," Miss Marple replied gently, "in villages like St. Haverley, one notices things simply to pass the time." Ashcombe's expression did not change, but there was the faintest narrowing of his eyes. "I hope," he said slowly, "that you will leave this matter to the authorities. It is rather more complicated than village matters." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "Human behavior is rarely complicated," she said. "People are wonderfully consistent once one recognizes the pattern." Ashcombe did not answer. Instead, he inclined his head slightly and returned to the drawing room. Miss Marple watched him go. Then she turned her attention toward the study door at the far end of the corridor where Inspector Mallory and Eleanor had gone. Voices drifted faintly from within. After several minutes, the door opened. Eleanor stepped out first. Her face had changed again. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by something else, anger. Inspector Mallory followed behind her, rubbing his temples with a tired expression. "Miss Marple," he said when he noticed her waiting, "I didn't realize you were still here." "I find waiting often produces interesting results," she said pleasantly. The inspector gave a weary half-smile. "I wish it would produce some answers." Eleanor glanced toward Miss Marple, then spoke quickly. "Inspector, may I speak with Miss Marple for a moment?" Mallory hesitated, then shrugged. "I suppose it can't hurt, but please stay inside the house." He returned to the drawing room, leaving the two women alone again. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "He thinks the box was stolen by someone trying to sell the information." "And you disagree?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes. Why?" Eleanor looked toward the drawing-room door to be certain they were alone. "Because the codes in that box are useless unless you know how to activate them." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "And who would know that?" "Only 3 people," Eleanor said quietly. "Sir Lionel, myself, and the government liaison assigned to oversee the negotiations." Miss Marple waited. Eleanor's voice dropped even further. "That liaison was Julian Ashcombe." The hallway seemed to grow still again. Miss Marple considered the information carefully. "And you believe he took the box?" "I think he intended to," Eleanor said. "But something went wrong." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Yes," she said softly. "Something clearly did." From the drawing room came the sound of raised voices. Inspector Mallory was speaking sharply to someone. Moments later, Colonel Whitcomb stepped into the hallway, looking visibly unsettled. "Inspector says the grounds have been searched," he announced. "No weapon anywhere." Miss Marple turned toward him. "No weapon at all?" "None." Whitcomb rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "That means whoever fired the shot still has it." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Quite possibly." But her thoughts had already moved elsewhere. The missing box, the useless documents left behind, the man who insisted the situation was dangerously complicated, and the girl who understood exactly how the codes worked. All the pieces were there, yet one small detail refused to fit. Miss Marple glanced once more toward the study door. When Sir Lionel had been found, the papers on the desk had spilled onto the floor, but the envelope containing them had been neatly opened. Almost as if someone had been searching for something, her expression softened slightly. "Yes," she murmured quietly to herself. "That was the difficulty. Because if Julian Ashcombe had come for the box, then Sir Lionel had already been expecting him." Night had fully settled over Haverley Manor. Outside, the gardens lay silent beneath a pale moon, and the abandoned tables of the afternoon gathering now appeared ghostly in the dim light. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, every corridor quieter than before, every voice lowered instinctively as though the walls themselves were listening. In the drawing-room, Inspector Mallory had resumed questioning the remaining guests, though fatigue was beginning to show in his face. The case had become more complicated with every passing hour, and the missing metal box hung over the investigation like a shadow. Miss Marple had returned to her chair near the window, her knitting resting neatly in her lap once again. She was not knitting at the moment. Her needles remained still as her thoughts arranged themselves carefully. Across the room, Colonel Whitcomb paced slowly in front of the fireplace, his heavy footsteps echoing faintly against the wooden floor. "I still fail to understand how a weapon can simply vanish," he said irritably. Inspector Mallory sighed. "The house has been searched twice, the gardens once. Unless the murderer managed to throw it somewhere beyond the grounds, it must still be inside." Mrs. Calder shuddered visibly. "You mean the killer is still carrying it?" "That is one possibility." At the far end of the room, Julian Ashcombe stood by the tall bookshelf, flipping absent-mindedly through a volume he clearly was not reading. His calm remained impressive, though Miss Marple noticed that he had begun watching the door more frequently. Waiting again. Eleanor Fielding had taken a seat near the lamp table, though her eyes moved constantly around the room, as if following thoughts that no one else could see. Miss Marple observed them all quietly. People rarely realized how much they revealed simply by being tired. After several minutes, the butler entered. "Inspector," he said, "a message has just arrived from the telegraph office in the village." Mallory looked up at once. "From London?" "Yes, sir." The butler handed him the envelope. The inspector opened it quickly and read the message inside. His expression hardened. "Well," he muttered, "what is it?" Colonel Whitcomb asked. Mallory looked up at the room. "The Foreign Office has confirmed that Sir Lionel's negotiations were indeed classified at the highest level." Julian Ashcombe closed the book slowly. "I told you as much." "Yes," said Mallory. "But there's more." He read aloud from the telegram. "If the authorization codes from the agreement are compromised, the governments involved may assume deliberate sabotage." Mrs. Calder gasped. "And that means," Mallory continued grimly, "military forces already positioned along the border could be mobilized within 48 hours. The words seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the room. Even Colonel Whitcomb fell silent. Miss Marple, however, watched Julian Ashcombe carefully. He had not reacted with surprise, only with calculation. That was interesting. Eleanor spoke suddenly. "Inspector, may I see the telegram?" Mallory hesitated but handed it to her. She read it quickly, her brow tightening. Then she said something unexpected. "They're wrong." The room turned toward her. "What do you mean?" Mallory asked. "The authorization codes alone aren't enough to activate the agreement," Eleanor explained. "They require a final verification phrase." Ashcombe's head lifted slightly. Mallory frowned. "And where would that phrase be?" Eleanor looked directly at him. "With Sir Lionel." A murmur spread across the room. "But Sir Lionel is dead," Whitcomb said. "Yes," Eleanor replied quietly. "Which means the agreement cannot be triggered unless someone already knew the phrase." Miss Marple noticed the slight tension that crossed Julian Ashcombe's face. Only for a second, but it was there. The inspector leaned forward. "Miss Bealding, who knew the verification phrase." Eleanor hesitated. "Sir Lionel, and?" The pause stretched. Finally she said softly, "And the liaison officer from London." All eyes turned slowly toward Julian Ashcombe. He remained perfectly still. Inspector Mallory folded his arms. "Mr. Ashcombe." Ashcombe's voice remained calm. "The girl is correct. I was informed of the phrase as part of my assignment." "And what exactly was your assignment?" "To oversee the agreement." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once. "Overseeing can mean many things," she said gently. Ashcombe turned toward her. "And what do you believe it means, Miss Marple?" She smiled pleasantly. "Oh, simply making sure everything proceeds according to plan. And you think it hasn't?" Miss Marple looked thoughtful. "Well, someone has been rather busy changing the plan." Inspector Mallory turned sharply. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the desk where Sir Lionel's personal belongings still rested on the silver tray. "Inspector," she said softly, "when Sir Lionel was discovered, several items were collected from the desk." "Yes." "His watch, his spectacles, his keys." "That's correct. And his cigarette case." Mallory nodded. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair and walked to the tray. She picked up the slim leather case carefully and opened it. Inside were several cigarettes, and something else, a narrow, folded slip of blue paper. The room grew very still. Miss Marple unfolded it gently. Typed across the small sheet were only 4 words. "Final verification, Frasse. Heavily Protocol." Inspector Mallory stared. "You're telling me the phrase was here the whole time?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Hidden in plain sight." Colonel Whitcomb looked baffled. "But why hide it there?" Miss Marple glanced toward Julian Ashcombe. "Because Sir Lionel had realized someone intended to steal the codes." Her voice remained calm, "and he wished to ensure that person could never use them." Ashcombe's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is speculation." Miss Marple folded the blue paper neatly. "Is it?" She turned toward the inspector. "You see, Sir Lionel knew the person coming for the box would also know the phrase." Mallory frowned. "So he hid it where the thief wouldn't think to look." "Precisely." Miss Marple's gaze rested once more on Ashcombe, and he was correct. The silence in the room deepened, because if Sir Lionel had hidden the verification phrase, then he had known exactly who was coming for the codes, and he had tried to stop them. The room seemed smaller after Miss Marple revealed the slip of blue paper. The quiet that followed was not merely silence, but the strained stillness that arrives when everyone realizes that the situation has shifted in a direction none of them expected. Inspector Mallory stared at the paper for several seconds before taking it carefully from Miss Marple's hand. "You're quite certain this was inside the cigarette case?" he asked. "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently. It appeared to have been tucked beneath the cigarettes. Mallory read the typed phrase again. "Fais-moi, fi verification, frassi, heavily, protocol." Colonel Whitcomb let out a low breath. Sir Lionel hid the final piece of the agreement on his own desk. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Some people hide important things in very elaborate places, but the cleverest hiding places are often the simplest. One rarely examines an object that appears entirely ordinary. Inspector Mallory slipped the paper back onto the tray with the other items. "Well, whoever took the box clearly didn't find this." "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. Her eyes drifted across the room. Eleanor Fielding looked stunned, though not entirely surprised. Mrs. Calder had sunk heavily into her chair, clearly struggling to understand the implications. Colonel Whitcomb stood rigidly beside the mantel. But Julian Ashcombe had not moved. His expression remained composed, yet there was now a faint sharpness in his gaze, as though a calculation had begun to shift. Inspector Mallory folded his arms. "If Sir Lionel suspected someone was coming for the box," he said slowly, "why didn't he alert the authorities?" Eleanor answered quietly, "Because the negotiations were secret. If the information leaked before the agreement was finalized, it could have caused exactly the crisis they were trying to prevent." Mallory frowned. "So he handled it himself?" "Yes." Miss Marple spoke softly, "And that is often where such plans go wrong." The inspector turned toward her. "You believe Sir Lionel confronted the thief?" "I believe he expected them." Julian Ashcombe finally spoke. "That is an interesting theory." Miss Marple met his gaze pleasantly. "One learns, Mr. Ashcombe, that when someone hides part of a secret but leaves the rest visible, it usually means they were waiting for someone specific." Ashcombe stepped forward slightly. "And you believe that someone was me?" The room seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear sir, I haven't said that at all. But you are thinking it." Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. "I am thinking that Sir Lionel had reason to distrust someone who knew both the authorization codes and the verification phrase." Inspector Mallory's eyes moved between them. "Mr. Ashcombe, how many people outside this room knew about those codes?" Ashcombe's voice remained steady. "Very few." "And how many knew the phrase as well?" Ashcombe did not answer immediately. Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Two." The inspector looked sharply at Ashcombe. "You and Sir Lionel." A tense silence followed. Ashcombe finally spoke. "Which means if someone intended to sabotage the agreement, they would also need the phrase." Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly." Colonel Whitcomb frowned, but the phrase was never taken. "Yes," said Miss Marple calmly. "Which suggests the thief did not know where it was hidden." Mallory looked puzzled. "Then why kill Sir Lionel at all?" Miss Marple considered the question for a moment. Then she said softly, "Because Sir Lionel realized something the thief had not anticipated." The inspector leaned forward. "What?" Miss Marple's gaze shifted slowly around the room. Someone else had discovered the plan. Eleanor suddenly spoke. "Sir Lionel told me yesterday that something about the negotiations felt wrong." Every head turned toward her. "We didn't mention that earlier," Mallory said sharply. "I didn't think it mattered," she replied quietly. "He said someone close to the negotiations might be manipulating the agreement." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Wes." Ashcombe's voice cut in calmly. "That is a serious accusation to make without evidence." Miss Marple looked at him with mild interest. "Oh, I don't believe Sir Lionel had proof." "Then why say such a thing?" "Because people often sense betrayal before they can explain it." The room fell silent again. Inspector Mallory rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If Sir Lionel suspected someone, perhaps he confronted them this afternoon. That seems likely, Miss Marple agreed, and that confrontation ended in murder. Mallory turned slowly toward Ashcombe. You were the last person to speak with Sir Lionel outside before he went into the house. Ashcombe nodded. Yes. What did you discuss? The progress of the negotiations. Did you argue? Ashcombe's expression hardened slightly. No. Miss Marple spoke again, her tone almost conversational. Sir Lionel had already hidden the verification phrase before the garden party began. Ashcombe looked at her sharply. How could you know that? Miss Marple's smile remained gentle, because if he had hidden it afterward, the killer would have searched the desk thoroughly. Inspector Mallory's eyes widened slightly, and the phrase would have been found. Precisely. Miss Marple folded her hands, which means the killer searched the desk for the metal box, but not for the phrase. Ashcombe's voice was quiet. And what does that prove? Miss Marple met his gaze calmly, that the killer believed the phrase was still with Sir Lionel. The silence in the room deepened, because if the killer believed that, then they would have had a reason to kill him. Inspector Mallory spoke slowly, unless the killer expected to force him to reveal it. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Her voice remained soft, but Sir Lionel never had the chance. The tension in the drawing room had become almost tangible. No one had moved for several moments after Miss Marple's quiet conclusion. The lamps cast steady light across the faces gathered there, illuminating expressions that ranged from confusion to alarm. Inspector Mallory stood beside the small table where the silver tray still held Sir Lionel's belongings. His eyes moved slowly from the blue slip of paper to the people in the room. If the killer believed Sir Lionel still had the verification phrase, he said carefully, then the purpose of the confrontation would have been to force him to reveal it. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes, and when he refused, the inspector did not finish the sentence, but everyone in the room understood. Colonel Whitcomb cleared his throat uneasily. Then the killer must have realized afterward that the phrase wasn't on him. Miss Marple folded her hands. Indeed, Mallory frowned. But the phrase was hidden here the entire time. That means the killer searched the desk and found the box, but not the phrase. Yes, which suggests they were in a hurry. Miss Marple gave a small approving nod. Very good, Inspector. Julian Ashcombe spoke calmly from across the room. Or it suggests something else. Mallory turned toward him. What? That the killer already knew the phrase. The remark caused a ripple of uncertainty among the others. Colonel Whitcomb looked puzzled, but that would make the murder unnecessary. Ashcombe's gaze remained steady. Unless the killer feared Sir Lionel might reveal their intentions before the codes could be used. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. An interesting argument. Ashcombe met her gaze. I try to consider every possibility. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Yes, you strike me as a man who plans carefully. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. Mr. Ashcombe, let us be direct. You were one of the only people who knew both the authorization codes and the verification phrase. That is correct. You were also seen speaking with Sir Lionel shortly before the murder, yes? And you admit he suspected someone close to the negotiations of manipulation. Ashcombe did not appear troubled. Suspicion is not evidence. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. No, she said gently, but behavior often is. She walked a few steps into the center of the room. I think we must consider what Sir Lionel believed was about to happen. The room listened. He knew someone intended to steal the authorization codes, Miss Marple continued. That is why he hid the verification phrase before the garden party began. Inspector Mallory nodded. And then he waited. Yes. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, almost reflective, because he expected the person responsible to make their move that very afternoon. Eleanor watched her closely now. And they did, she said quietly. Yes. Miss Marple turned slowly toward Julian Ashcombe. But something went wrong. Ashcombe's expression remained composed. According to your theory, Miss Marple clasped her hands lightly. We see the plan required two things, the codes from the metal box and the verification phrase. And the thief found the box, Miss Marple said, but not the phrase. Ashcombe shrugged faintly. An unfortunate oversight. Yes. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly, which means the killer did not search the desk carefully enough. Inspector Mallory frowned. That seems obvious. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector, that is the interesting part. She paused. Because someone experienced in intelligence work would search very carefully. The room fell silent. Ashcombe's gaze sharpened. Miss Marple continued calmly. Unless they believed the phrase was not hidden in the room at all. Mallory blinked. You mean, the killer assumed Sir Lionel still had it on him? Eleanor spoke softly. That's why he was shot. Yes. Miss Marple nodded. Sir Lionel refused to reveal the phrase. Colonel Whitcomb frowned. But after killing him, the murderer would have searched the body. Exactly. Mallory's eyes widened slightly. But the phrase wasn't there. No. Miss Marple looked toward the tray again, which means the killer realized too late that Sir Lionel had hidden it somewhere else. Julian Ashcombe spoke quietly. An unfortunate mistake for them. Miss Marple turned toward him. Yes. Her voice remained gentle. But there is another small detail. Ashcombe waited. Miss Marple smiled faintly. When the body was discovered, the envelope containing the agreement papers had already been opened. Inspector Mallory nodded. That's right. But Sir Lionel had not opened it. Mallory frowned. How do you know that? Miss Marple gestured toward the desk. Because the letter opener was still in its stand. The inspector looked puzzled. So? Sir Lionel was extremely meticulous. A man like that always used a letter opener. The realization crept slowly across the inspector's face. You're saying someone else opened the envelope? Yes. Miss Marple nodded gently. The person searching the desk. Ashcombe's voice was very quiet now. And what does that prove? Miss Marple looked directly at him. That the search began before the shot was fired. A stunned silence followed. Inspector Mallory spoke slowly. You mean the killer began searching the desk while Sir Lionel was still alive? Yes, which means Mallory turned sharply toward Ashcombe. The murderer expected Sir Lionel to cooperate. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but he did not. Ashcombe said nothing. Miss Marple took one more step forward, and when Sir Lionel refused to reveal the phrase, her eyes held his. The negotiation ended with a gunshot. The room felt suddenly very cold, because now only one question remained. Who had been confident enough to search the desk while Sir Lionel was still standing there? For several seconds after Miss Marple finished speaking, no one moved. The silence that filled the drawing room was deeper than before. No longer the uneasy quiet of speculation, but the tense stillness that accompanies the final moments before truth is spoken aloud. Inspector Mallory stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on Julian Ashcombe. Colonel Whitcomb looked from one face to another, struggling to follow the quiet logic that had unfolded piece by piece. Mrs. Calder had pressed a hand to her mouth. Even Mrs. Bantry, who prided herself on composure in difficult situations, had gone completely silent. Only Miss Marple appeared entirely at ease. She folded her hands gently over the handle of her knitting bag and regarded the room with the mild expression of someone discussing a rather ordinary village matter. Inspector Mallory spoke first. You're suggesting the killer entered the study expecting Sir Lionel to hand over the phrase willingly. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. And when he refused, the killer searched the desk in front of him. That would explain the opened envelope, she replied. Mallory turned slowly toward Julian Ashcombe. Mr. Ashcombe, you were one of the only people who knew about both the codes and the phrase. Ashcombe's voice remained steady, as we have already established, and you were also the last person seen speaking with Sir Lionel before he entered the house. Yes. The inspector's gaze sharpened. Would you care to explain what happened next? Ashcombe gave a faint, almost weary smile. I believe Miss Marple has already decided that. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Oh no, Mr. Ashcombe. I only observe what people do. Ashcombe met her eyes. And what do you believe I did? Miss Marple answered with quiet clarity. You came into the study shortly after Sir Lionel. You believed the codes were still in the desk and that the phrase remained with him. Ashcombe said nothing. You expected him to cooperate, she continued. After all, you were both involved in the negotiations. Inspector Mallory's voice was low, but Sir Lionel had discovered the truth. Miss Marple nodded gently. Yes. Eleanor Fielding spoke softly from across the room. He knew the agreement was being manipulated. Miss Marple glanced toward her. Yes, my dear. Sir Lionel realized that someone intended to use the authorization codes to falsify the agreement. Colonel Whitcomb looked stunned. You mean to make it appear that one country had broken the treaty? Exactly, Miss Marple said. Ashcombe's calm expression remained, but the air around him had grown noticeably colder. Mallory spoke again. And if the governments involved believed the agreement had been sabotaged, military retaliation could begin almost immediately. Miss Marple finished. Mrs. Calder whispered faintly, a war. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. Inspector Mallory looked back at Ashcombe. So Sir Lionel confronted you. Ashcombe remained silent. Miss Marple continued. He refused to give you the verification phrase. We searched the desk while he stood there, but you could not find it. The room listened in breathless quiet. Ashcombe finally spoke. And so, according to your story, I shot him. Miss Marple regarded him kindly. Yes, yet the weapon has not been found. Miss Marple smiled slightly. That was the clever part. Inspector Mallory leaned forward. You know where it is? Yes. Miss Marple gestured lightly toward the fireplace. Everyone turned. For a moment no one understood. Then the inspector stepped quickly toward the hearth. The fire had burned low hours ago, leaving only a bed of pale ash. Mallory took the poker and gently stirred the remains. There was a dull, metallic sound. He bent down and carefully lifted something blackened from the ashes. A small pistol. The room erupted in startled murmurs. Mallory stared at it. You burned it. Ashcombe's expression had finally changed. The calm had faded. You're making assumptions again, he said. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Mr. Ashcombe, only observations. She gestured toward the hearth. The weapon was small enough to be concealed easily, and during the confusion after the body was discovered, several people passed through this room. Inspector Mallory nodded slowly. You could have dropped it into the fire when no one was watching. Miss Marple's voice remained soft, but the real mistake was not the gun. Ashcombe looked at her sharply. Then what was? Miss Marple's eyes rested on him calmly. You stayed. The room grew quiet again. Someone who had just killed a man and stolen the codes would normally leave as quickly as possible. She continued, but you could not. Inspector Mallory's voice was grim. Because you still needed the verification phrase. Miss Marple nodded. Yes. She looked toward the tray where the small blue paper still lay. You believed Sir Lionel had hidden it somewhere in the house, so you remained here, waiting, searching for an opportunity to find it. Ashcombe said nothing. Miss Marple spoke the final truth gently. But Sir Lionel had already defeated you. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. You'll come with us now, Mr. Ashcombe. For the first time that evening, Julian Ashcombe did not argue. His gaze moved briefly across the room, pausing on Eleanor Fielding and then on Miss Marple. We have a remarkable talent, he said quietly. Miss Marple smiled politely, only for understanding people. Ashcombe allowed the inspector to take the pistol and signal the constable. As he was led toward the door, the tension that had filled the house for hours finally began to lift. Outside, the night air moved softly through the garden. Mrs. Calder sank into her chair in relief. Colonel Whitcomb exhaled slowly. Eleanor remained still for a moment, then turned toward Miss Marple. You saved the agreement, she said. Miss Marple shook her head. Oh no, my dear, Sir Lionel saved it. He understood that some secrets must be hidden carefully, and others must be hidden in plain sight. She picked up her knitting again and resumed the gentle rhythm of her needles. Outside, the quiet village of St. Haverley returned slowly to its peaceful routine. Yet beneath that calm lingered the familiar truth Miss Marple knew so well. Even the smallest village could stand quietly at the edge of the world's greatest dangers, and more often than not, those dangers began with something very simple, a secret, and the person who believed they could control it